5 New Year's resolutions for podcasters. Welcome to the Audacity to Podcast, episode 249. Thank you for joining me for another episode of the Audacity to Podcast. I'm Daniel J. Lewis, and this is the award-winning how-to podcast about podcasting. It's where I give you the guts and teach you the tools to launch or improve your own podcast for sharing your passions and finding success. You might be listening to this around the time of the new year. Nonetheless, what you're about to hear can apply at any time of the year, and that is setting New Year's resolutions for your podcast. And a New Year's resolution could simply be, what are you resolving to do in the next year from now, and giving yourself a 1-year deadline. So this exact date, by next year, you hope to have accomplished what? I'm going to suggest to you 5 New Year's resolutions for your podcast. Number 1, resolve to publish consistently. Number 2, resolve to improve. Number 3, resolve to grow your audience. Number 4, resolve to attend a relevant in-person event. And number 5, resolve to do something new and bold. If you want to follow along in the show notes for this episode, number 249, please visit theaudacitytopodcast.com/resolutions2016. Number 1, resolve to publish consistently. Consistency is one of the most important aspects of building an audience when we're creating content and using content for marketing, or as we call it, content marketing, or sometimes also called inbound marketing. Consistency really matters because when you're putting out content consistently, iTunes, Google, and humans learn to expect new content from you at a particular time. It's also great for creating more content out there because it means that if you are a daily show, then after 30 days, you have 30 episodes out there. If you're a weekly show, then after 1 year, you have about 50 episodes out there. That is if you publish consistently. Consistency is also one of those things that's a big struggle for us because if we don't do the podcast as part of our business or schedule it into a regular part of our life, it's very easy to fall behind. Even some podcasters I highly respect have occasionally dropped in their consistency at times because of other priorities and such. And there are good reasons often for that. And I'm not saying that you must adhere to a publishing schedule or else you're no good as a podcaster. No, that's not what I'm saying. But consistency is very important for growing your audience, putting your content out there, and for developing habits in not only yourself, but in the lives of your audience that they know Tuesday mornings to expect a certain podcast. Or for me, I don't necessarily expect a certain episode of a podcast on a particular day because I often fall behind in my podcast consumption. But since switching podcast apps, I'm using Overcast now, by the way, I'm able to keep up with my podcast a lot better because I can listen even faster than I could listen before. And so I am a bit more aware of when podcasts come out, but what I have been very used to is hearing the closing theme music of one podcast, and my brain was conditioned to expect the opening theme of a different podcast that would normally come right after that podcast. That was consistency to me. I expected to hear such and such podcast and then hear the other podcast after that. If someone did not publish an episode that week, I would notice because their theme song wasn't after the other theme song. Your audience might be like that, where they've grown accustomed to hearing your podcast after another podcast or at a particular time or anything like that. Think about what kind of changes would you have to make in order to not miss a single episode in the next year, whether that be the next calendar year or the next 365 days from when you're hearing this right now. How can you make that happen? Yes, I know there are holidays and family events and other things like that that can get in the way, and certainly higher priority than your podcast. Please always put your family above your podcast. But it's also easy for us to justify these short hiatuses because of the holidays. Like we think, oh, it's Independence Day, or oh, it's Thanksgiving, or, oh, it's Valentine's Day, or, oh, it's Memorial Day or Labor Day. And if if you're from outside the United States, you probably noticed that I just now mentioned all United States holidays, or at least when I referred to them, I was thinking United States holidays like Independence Day on July 4th and Thanksgiving on the Thursday in November and that kind of thing. Well, Canada has a different Thanksgiving. Mexico has a different kind of Independence Day. Different countries do have different holidays. So for you to say it's Thanksgiving in November will sound odd to a Canadian because the Canadian might be thinking, what are you talking about? Thanksgiving was a month and a half ago. I don't know. Why are you celebrating Thanksgiving so late? Or it doesn't matter to them. Like a holiday like Labor Day. Does that matter to an international audience? Probably not. So instead of looking at these holidays as a chance to take a break, and it's important to still spend time with your family if you do that on these holidays, still look at what kind of content you could produce. Maybe it's shorter content. That's fine. You don't have to apologize for it. I'm actually pre-recording this episode before it's publishing, as well as the following episodes, because I don't want to take a hiatus during the Christmas and New Year's break. And also I'll be doing some traveling, going to the Consumer Electronics Show. Watch for upcoming videos, by the way, from that. Some really cool stuff that I'll be talking about at CES 2016 in Las Vegas. But these moments when you might be tempted to take a break because of a holiday could be great moments for you to leverage for growing your podcast. Think about it like this. How many other podcasters are taking a break at that time? Sure, they might have good reasons for doing so, but what if you're the only podcast in your niche that releases an episode during that time? I host a TV show fan podcast about ABC's TV show Once Upon a Time. And in our first year, during the hiatus, the summer hiatus from the first season to the second season, we still had podcast episodes. About every 2 weeks, I think, was the schedule we tried to keep. And the fans loved that because they didn't get content from the TV show that they love, but they loved that the conversation was continuing in the podcast. Yes, our downloads dropped during that time. That's fine, because that didn't mean that we actually lost people. It just meant it wasn't as much of an interest to everyone. But when the season came back, our downloads came back up as well. So you could leverage a hiatus that most people might take to still put content out there, content that people might find more quickly because the other guys aren't publishing. A certain holiday could be a great opportunity to grow your podcast as well, because maybe you release some very time-sensitive content, and there's a different issue there to discuss and decide on whether you want to be timeless or timely with your content. But let's take Christmas, for example, or that holiday season. Many people give and receive gifts, and a popular gift is some kind of electronic device that most likely can consume podcasts. So having a podcast episode around the Christmas time could mean that that episode might be downloaded by new listeners who are just discovering podcasts or got a new device and they're subscribing to all their favorite podcasts, and they might be making decisions at that moment of which podcast to keep based on who has an episode fairly recently. Your results certainly will vary, so you have to decide this on your own, what kind of breaks you'll take. But what if you planned to publish consistently with only planned intentional breaks that you think would be good for your audience, and breaks around holidays or events that do truly affect your entire audience? Christmas and the New Year's are usual times that do affect most of the world, because most of the world celebrates some kind of holiday around the Christmas time and some kind of New Year's around the same time. Not every single country does, certainly, but most of your audience probably will be taking that time off, spending time with their family, but also maybe consuming more podcasts during that time. Personally, I consume fewer podcasts when I'm taking a break because it means less travel and less downtime, in a sense, and less time that I can spend wearing headphones listening to something. Even if I'm traveling with my wife, usually we'll be talking in the car instead of each of us wearing our own headphones. Maybe that'll change in the future. I don't know. But for me right now, I consume fewer podcasts during a holiday, but other people probably consume more podcasts. Your results will vary, but what would it take for you to commit to not missing a single episode in the next 365 days. That's resolution number 1. Resolve to publish consistently. Number 2, resolve to improve. Regardless of where you are in podcasting and how good you think you are or aren't, there is still room to improve. I frequently talk about the cornerstones of a great podcast, and I now say that there are 5 all mandatory cornerstones for high quality in your podcast. Number 1, content. That's the message that you share. Number 2, the presentation. That's how you communicate the message. Number 3, production. That's the technical side of things, the microphone, the mixers, your editing, how you piece these things together. Number 4, the promotion, how you market and grow your podcast. And number 5, profit. Yes, I am saying this is a mandatory cornerstone of a great podcast. And profit doesn't mean only money, but it's the purpose and the goals of your podcast. And if you want to learn more about profiting from your podcast and all the different ways you could profit from your podcast and how to profit from your podcast, I've got a great free webinar for you coming up on January 28th, 2016. It will be with Brian from ProfitCast, and I'll be hosting this webinar as part of Podcaster Society, but this webinar is open to the public. Podcaster Society is designed to help you improve your podcast. It's everything you need after episode 1. And in our free webinar in January, on January 28th, we'll be talking about how to profit from your podcast and what kind of profit you should think about with your podcast. And it's not all about money. I'm really looking forward to that. And if you'd like to register, the link is in the show notes for this episode, or go to podcasterssociety.com/webinar to register for that free webinar. The replay will be available for about 40 hours after the webinar is live, but after that, the replay will only be available for Podcaster Society members. So if you don't want to miss the webinar at all, make sure you join Podcaster Society when registration opens up again. Otherwise, please join us for that free webinar on January 28th. Sign up for that at podcastersociety.com/webinar. And in Podcaster Society, we talk about content, presentation, production, promotion, and profit. For you right now, critically evaluate your own podcast or ask someone else to do it, and do ask them to be critical and objective in how they're reviewing it and evaluating it, and discover what areas where you need to improve. That could be in your content. Maybe you're simply not sharing that interesting of a message. It's not very helpful. It's not entertaining. Or maybe it is helpful or entertaining, or both, but your presentation isn't very good. You stumble over your words. You're not very engaged or exciting in listening to, or the style of the presentation. Maybe it's a co-hosted thing and you realize that, I really would do much better with this as a solo show. Or maybe you're solo and you find yourself struggling. And so you realize I should really do this with a co-host. Maybe you need to change your presentation or improve that. Improve your production, upgrade your equipment, your software, your workflow, maybe. Your promotion. How are you really working to grow your podcast, to bring new listeners to your podcast? Or are you promoting at all your old content that might still be relevant and it's timeless, valuable content? How are you promoting that? Your profit. What are the purposes and goals for your podcast? How are you working to improve those and meet those? So this is resolution number 2, resolve to improve. Find those areas, and maybe all you can do is pick one and focus on improving that and making it incredible in the coming year. Number 3, resolve to grow your audience. I think we would all love to have a larger audience. Let's all be honest about that. Yes, we would like more people listening or watching. And growing your audience usually is not a passive thing. There's this thing that I'm going to call podcast inflation. That is the natural growth that occurs with any podcast. It's as more people come into podcast consumption, as people stumble upon your podcast, it is podcast inflation. It's very small, very slow, very passive. Yes, your audience is growing, but very, very, very slowly. Just like, yes, your money in your bank account is growing with interest, but sometimes it's even slower than the rate of inflation. So you might want to look at other ways to invest and grow your savings. Same thing with your podcast. Instead of letting it grow very slowly, either at the pace of podcast inflation or maybe even below the inflation rate, what can you do to more actively grow your podcast. It takes extra work. Maybe it will take some planning, maybe even some financial investments in your podcast to educate you further on things, to buy tools to make it easier, to pay for services, whatever the case. It does take actual action to grow your podcast beyond that standard podcast inflation rate. So what can you do to grow your podcast larger than if you did nothing? Make that a goal and resolve to accomplish that goal in the next year. That's number 3, resolve to grow your audience. Number 4, resolve to attend a relevant in-person event. Networking is hugely beneficial, not only for the potential to meet new people who could be guests on your podcast, or you could be a guest on their podcast, or you might find some other way of partnering together in business, cross-promotion, networking, anything like that. But when you go to an event that's relevant to the content that you share in the podcast that you host, there can be this amazing new energy infused into you that feeds that passion a whole lot more. And when you leave that event, you might have this new vigor for your content and production, and you might have new ideas and new inspiration to get back into podcasting, or to strengthen your podcast, grow your podcast, improve it, do any of these other resolutions I'm sharing with you. In-person events can be like that, very energizing. And you know that I love podcast movement, and I do also love other social media conferences, and I like attending these, speaking at these and such. But you might need to be honest with yourself and realize that the best event for you may not be a podcasting conference. It may be something that's far more relevant for your niche. Maybe it's something like Comic-Con if you host a TV show fan podcast, or Dragon Con, or some kind of gaming convention, or anything like that. It could be a local thing, regional, national event, maybe international event, and it can have far more people interested in your niche than if you go to a podcasting or social media event. I'm not saying that podcasting and social media events are bad. Certainly, if you can, go to one of them, because they can teach you a lot of ways that you can improve your podcast and new tools. They can introduce you to new people, and all kinds of amazing things can happen at events like that. I'm really looking forward to the next podcast movement, and I will even be sponsoring the next podcast movement with some really cool things. And I'm looking forward to also being a speaker there if I have that option and opportunity. But for you, you might need to find something else. And that could be even more invigorating for you than going to a podcasting event. If you need some ideas, look at conference and event sites like Lanyard or Meetup, or maybe there are industry websites and publications that you're already familiar with. Pay attention to who's advertising on there. Maybe they have an event page. Maybe you could contact them and say, what events are you going to? What events are you sponsoring? And that can give you great ideas for where you could go and network with other people in your industry. After all, who would you rather have listening or viewing your podcast? Other podcasters, or people who actually care the most about the topic that you're discussing in your podcast, whatever that topic is? Now, sometimes, yes, that is other podcasters. If you are like me and you host a podcast about podcasting or something talking about the podcasting industry, then you want other podcasters listening to you. And yes, it is very easy for other podcasters to listen to other podcasters, but most likely your ideal audience is outside of the podcasting industry. It's in your industry. So find those people, introduce them to podcasting, and you can make the world a much better place too by introducing new people to the field of podcasts. So this is resolution number 4, resolve to attend a relevant in-person event. I highly recommend you find one and go there in the next 365 days. Little side note here, maybe you could even become a speaker at that event or submit to be a speaker at that event. And that can be a great way to grow your podcast, build authority and influence in your specific niche. Resolution number 5, resolve to do something new and bold. I recommend that you think radically here. What would be something crazy, something big, something amazing that you could do in the next 365 days? Make that a goal and resolve to do that thing this coming year. It could be maybe you want to create your first product for your podcast. And that doesn't mean it has to be a $1,000 course or an online community or anything like that. It could be a $5 product. It could be a bonus episode you sell as ways to raise money for your podcast. I've done another episode about product ideas for podcasters, and I have a link to that in the show notes for this episode, number 249, at theaudacitypodcast.com/resolutions2016. You could also look at hosting a live in-person event for your community. Those are a lot of fun. You might want to start a whole new show. Maybe you're on a network, or you're starting a network, or you simply want another podcast because there's something else you're really excited about. Maybe you want to add another media platform. You've been doing audio for so long, maybe you'll start doing video, or maybe you want to start blogging on a regular basis, or getting into some other social network, live streaming, or on Blab or Periscope or anything like that. Maybe you want to start using a new tool this year, something radically different. Think big, think bold, think new, think something more than simply more. Think completely different. Do something radical. Make that a resolution for this year. And there are so many opportunities of new things that you could do that are big and bold and radical that you might get a little overwhelmed with all of these opportunities. I'll make it simple. Pick one. Pick only one. Yes, you could do others, but pick one. Focus so much on accomplishing that one thing that then when you finish, you can look back with pride at that accomplishment, that you tried something radical and you achieved it. Or maybe you failed, but you can still look back with pride and realize, I gave it everything. I worked really hard, so I know that won't work for me. And there's no shame in that. Where there could be shame is if you give it a little bit of effort and you say, it didn't work for me, but I didn't really try that hard. Don't be that person who says that. Try hard. If it fails, hey, fail hard. That's perfectly okay. Then you will know without a doubt that that thing won't work for you, and there will never be well, maybe I should have done this. Try to live a life where you don't have regrets and where you don't say, oh, I should have done this. Live a life where you are glad you took risks and you realize from that failure that you learned something amazing or it opened up a new opportunity. I've had things like that in my past, and I am grateful for them. I've had some very rough, dark days in my past, even involving relationships. But I recognize today that if it wasn't for those big failures in the past, I couldn't be who I am today, where I am today, or with who I am with today. And I'm very grateful for my wife, Jenny, and I love her a lot. I'm very grateful for the rough road of getting to this point, because if it wasn't for that rough road, maybe I would have missed this opportunity today. So this is resolution number 5, resolve to do something new and bold. These 5 resolutions for the upcoming year, regardless of what time of year you're listening to this, think of this as 1 calendar year from right now. These 5 resolutions are at theaudacitypodcast.com/resolutions2016. They are: number 1, resolve to publish consistently. Number 2, resolve to improve. Number 3, resolve to grow your audience. Number 4, resolve to attend a relevant in-person event. And number 5, resolve to do something new and bold. That's what I'd like to see you do with your podcast in the next 365 and 1/4 days. If there's something else that you have as a resolution for your podcast, then please comment on the show notes for this episode, number 249, at theaudacitypodcast.com/resolutions2016. That's also where you can go to get the links that I mentioned in this show to those previous episodes and other things, and especially the link to the upcoming webinar with Brian from ProfitCast. I'm really looking forward to this. It will be on January 28th, 2016, and we'll be talking about profiting from your podcast, how to do it, what podcasting profit really is. It's not all about the money. And we'd love to see you in that free webinar. Register it from the link in the show notes or go to podcastersociety.com/webinar. I'd love to see you in that webinar or for you to get the replay after that. Register there at the website for the webinar or the replay. And if you're interested in joining Podcaster Society, then you'll get access to that webinar after it's taken down from public access. That's at podcastersociety.com/webinar. If you need help with your podcast, helping you to improve your podcast this upcoming year or fix a problem or start a podcast, anything like that, I'd love to help you out. Please contact me through the website at theaudacitytopodcast.com. It could be that we set up some consulting, some coaching, a podcast evaluation, or maybe you have a question that you'd like me to address on a future episode of the Audacity to Podcast. I'd love to hear from you, so please contact me through the website at theaudacitytopodcast.com. You can call and leave a voicemail there, email me, comment on show notes for episodes, send a voice message, and much more. That's at theaudacitytopodcast.com. Please watch on YouTube and my video channels for upcoming videos from the Consumer Electronics Show 2016 that will be from Las Vegas. I'm looking forward to seeing awesome technologies and sharing cool things with you in video form. So you want to subscribe to my separate video show either on YouTube or on iTunes. Those links are also on the website at theaudacitytopodcast.com. And we'll be live from CES at tpn.tv. Now that I've given you some of the guts and taught you some of the tools, it's time for you to go launch or improve your own podcast for sharing your passions and finding success. I'm Daniel J. Lewis from theaudacitytopodcast.com. Thanks for listening. The Audacity to Podcast is a proud member of Noodle Mix Network. Find more of our award-winning and award-nominated podcasts to make you think, laugh, and succeed at noodle.mx. The Audacity to Podcast is